All right, guys, here is period three. All right, this one's even more lengthy than period two. I'm going to try to get it done in half an hour here, but I do want to be complete. So let's look at the period three key concepts. All right, so obviously the British are going to attempt to assert tighter control. It's kind of going to be the end of salutary neglect. All right, that's a big part of period three that's going to lead us up to the Revolutionary War. All right, and finally it kind of starts, and period three starts with the 7 Years' War, as we know it as the French and Indian War in this area. All right. Um, in Europe, we got a lot of wars going on too, but for the most part, they're just big fights. Lots of people die. Nothing changes place. Let's just kill each other and not have a whole lot change. All right. Most territories end up with their original owners. Not a lot changes. All right. Same thing happens in New France and New England, right? The colonies, they're competing with each other, especially in the areas of the Midwest, Ohio River Valley, the Great Lakes. Who's going to control that? And Native Americans are caught between them. Most prefer the French. All right, we talked a lot about how the French generally treated the Native Americans a lot better. All right, the British colonists want land. As a general rule, the French want trade, so obviously the Native Americans are generally going to support the French. All right. However, we always have these new tribes that are being pierced together. We talked about that. As these tribes die, people in the tribes die of diseases and wars and things like that. We get these new tribes piecing themselves together, and sometimes we get a little bit of debate about whether people are going to support England or support France. All right, this is a time when Franklin's Albany Plan comes together to try to organize the colonies. Remember, Franklin's Albany Plan is rejected. All right, also remember the famous "Don't Tread on Me" flag with the snake cut up into divisions. All right, is from the Albany Plan. It's not from the colonists, or excuse me, the Revolutionary War. All right. So the British are going to defeat the French. The French are going to be kicked out of North America. All right. But there's going to be a lot of expense, and there's going to be a lot of problems with the Native Americans. So we get Pontiac's rebellion after the French Revolution. All right. Where Pontiac is going to rise up against the colonists. It's going to be forced put down by British troops. All right. Because of that, we get the Proclamation Line of 1763. That's a big deal. All right. It says that draws a line in the sand, basically says the colonists can't move past this. Everything past that is Native American territory. All right. Obviously, the colonists aren't going to be real happy with that. They're going to violate it constantly, and that's going to be a significant beginning to the problems with the British. We're going to see, again, the end of salutary neglect, especially because of the enormous debt. All right. The thought being that one of the reasons that England has this enormous debt is because they spent a lot of time trying to protect the colonists. So therefore, the colonists should help pay for that. All right. They're going to attempt to tax the colonists. Obviously, that's not going to really work too well. The Revenue Act of 1762 tries to end the colonial bribery to defy the Navigation Acts. That's not going to work. We're going to start to get stationing of troops in America. All right, a lot of the colonists are going to say, hey, the French and Indian War is over. Why do we need British troops here? Get the heck out. All right, but they're going to actually have more troops that are going to come into America. The Currency Act of 1764 bans the colonies from using paper money. For the most part, the paper money was worthless. All right, and they were trying to use that worthless money to pay off the debts that they had with a lot of the British people. Not going to work very well either. All right. Native groups are going to sought both to continue trading with the Europeans, but also to resist encroachments on the land. All right, we had Pontiac's Rebellion, which we've talked about. We have a Native American called Neolin who calls for all Indians to reject the white ways and white goods, especially rum. Alcohol is going to be a significant problem for the Native Americans. All right, we're going to see troops stationed in frontier forts. British troops that are stationed there to kind of keep the Native Americans and the colonists apart. Again, an attempt that's not going to work too well. All right, the Iroquois are going to attempt to remain neutral because they want to maintain that trade benefit. All right, the French are gone. Can they trade furs with the English now? So they're going to try to kind of make friendly for a little bit. Not going to work too well either. All right, however, because of this, we're going to get competition, all right, in the different North American environments, all right, and many colonists are going to assert these ideas of self-government. We talked about that in period two. These ideas that they have, that they've governed themselves for 150 years, they can continue to govern themselves. They don't need British interference, all right? So this is a big thing. All right, this is where we get all the acts, the taxes, no representation, the whole concept of taxation without representation. All right, so I'm going to go through just a bunch of examples of this, right? We talked about the Revolution Act of 1762, talked about the Proclamation Line of 1763, talked about the Currency Act of 1764. All right, none of those were particularly effective, but they're attempts by the British to regain control. All right, the Sugar Act of 1764 is an interesting one. It lowers the taxes. All right, the Sugar Act lowers the taxes. All right, thinking that the colonies will pay lower taxes. All right, not going to work too well. All right, but it also takes away what the colonists are going to think of as their right to a trial. All right, they're going to actually be tried in basically military courts if they violate the Sugar Act. It's going to allow searches of private property to look for violations of the Sugar Act, and that's going to cause a lot of trouble. Stamp Act of 1765 comes along. All right, the colonies are given a year to produce alternate taxes. All right, you don't want the Stamp Act? Give me something else. All right, it's the real first significant attempt to directly tax colonists. It's going to put a tax on basically paper, a lot of different papers, from newspapers to magazines to legal documents, all right, pamphlets, things along those lines, all right. And obviously the Americans aren't going to be real happy about this idea that you're going to have a direct tax on them. Quartering Act of 1765, that colonial assemblies are going to be required to allow troops to come into private houses. A little bit cut off there, sorry, in the top. All right, we're going to start to see significant resistance to the Stamp Act. All right, we're going to get the Stamp Act Congress called for by James Otis. All right, they're going to demand this idea that the Stamp Act should go away because only assemblies could tax their own colonies. The British couldn't. All right, we're going to get this idea of direct representation versus virtual representation. All right, the British believed in virtual representation. Every person in Parliament represented every single person. All right. Franklin says, no, we want direct representation. We want representation from the colonies in the Parliament. It's not going to work. We're going to get the first boycott. The Sons of Liberty are going to arise out of this to use threats and intimidation against officials who are going to try to enforce the Stamp Act. That's led by John Hancock and Samuel Adams. All right, the Stamp Act is finally repealed, largely due to the boycott. All right, British merchants actually appealed to have the Stamp Act repealed because they didn't making any money because nobody would buy their stuff. All right, so they repealed the Stamp Act, and one of my favorite acts, the Declaratory Act of 1766. Basically, okay, we'll take that tax off, but if we want to tax you, we can because we're in charge. All right, that's basically what the Declaratory Act says. All right, we get the Township Act of 1767 then. Again, the idea that we're going to tax a bunch of different stuff and then that money would go to pay the salaries of the governors and the judges. All right, remember right now the salaries of the governors and judges are often paid by colonial assemblies. All right, obviously then whoever pays you the money is your boss. So the colonial assemblies seem to be the bosses of the judges and the governors, so therefore they quite often do what the colonists want them to do. This was an attempt to free them of that. Again, not going to work too well. All right, the Restraining Act of 1767 is going to be an attempt by the Parliament to actually start to dissolve assemblies, specifically in this case the one in New York, for not following the law, in this case the Quartering Act. All right. We're going to get continuing resistance again. We're going to get more boycotts. We figured out that boycotts are the best tool to avoid these taxes. All right. The Sons of Liberty are going to help enforce that boycott. And again, we're going to get a repeal of the Township Act, except for the tax on tea. All right. Why is the tax on tea left on? Basically for them to say, hey, listen, we can still tax you. All right, so it's kind of like the Declaratory Act. All right, again, Franklin's going to call for the Albany Plan to unify the colonies, kind of a new Albany Plan. Not going to work either. All right, and then in 1770, we get the Boston Massacres. All right, the colonists provoked the soldiers. They were yelling at them, calling them names, throwing snowballs at them. All right, finally they fired, kind of accidentally maybe. I don't think it was an attempt by the British soldiers to kill a bunch of unarmed colonists, but it happened. All right, the soldiers are put on trial. All right, Sam Adams actually gets his cousin to defend him. All right, the whole idea was to show the British that trial by jury is the essential right of all British citizens. All right, and therefore even these soldiers who committed this act that the Americans are going to paint as a massacre still have the right to a trial. And actually John Adams is going to get them off. All right, in 1772, a customs ship, British customs ship, goes aground, local patriots are going to actually go out and burn the British ship down to the waterline. That's the Gaspee affair. We're going to get the committees of correspondence that are going to be created by Senator Adams to keep resistance going throughout the colonies. All right, the Tea Act of 1773. All right, Parliament really wasn't trying to tax the Americans, and they kind of realized this. They were trying to rescue a company, and that's really going to be get the colonists mad. They're going to be able to paint this as the British taxing the colonists in order to save a British colony, and that's not going to sit too well. All right, that's why we get the Boston Tea Party. That's going to really make George III the mad. Make George III very upset, all right, and he's going to stop trying to kind of negotiate with the colonists, and now it's time to punish them, all right, and that's why we get the coercive acts, which are also called the intolerable acts, all right, closed down Boston Harbor, all right, annulled the Massachusetts Charter and banned any town meetings going after their assemblies, reinforced the Quartering Act, all right, and then the Administration of Justice Act, which says that if British officials are accused of crimes, they get to leave. They get to not be tried in Massachusetts. They go back to be tried in Great Britain. All of these are going to be really, really upsetting to the Americans, all right. Quebec Act of 1774, all right, is not really officially part of the Intolerable Acts, but it's kind of lumped together, especially by the colonists, all right. Basically, at least in the way the colonists see, the French Canadians are just given the Ohio Valley, which obviously we've talked about the colonists want. Again, another thing that's going to make them really, really mad. We get the First Continental Congress in 1774, all right, in response to these acts, and they pass what's called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which is very, very similar to the Declaration of Independence. It doesn't call for independence. It just said these are all the things the king has done. We don't like it. All right. That's going to lead to Lexington and Concord in 1775. All right. We're going to get a British army sent in to crush dissent in Boston. They're going to go out to Lexington and Concord because they hear that there's weapons there. All right. They want to arrest Hancock and Sad Adams, which remember are the heads of the Sons of Liberty. All right. And that's where we're going to get the first firing, the so-called shot heard around the world. All right, that's going to get us the Second Continental Congress, which creates the Continental Army, puts George Washington in charge, does a last-ditch effort to get along the Olive Branch petition, which isn't going to work. All right, then is going to have the Declaration of the Causes and Necessities of Taking Up Arms. All right, these are the reasons why we have to fight for our independence, and the Second Continental Congress is going to vote for independence. All right, Thomas Paine is going to publish Common Sense in 1776. All right, attacks not only Parliament but also the monarchy, and basically ridicules the idea of an island of the size of Great Britain controlling an entire continent. All right, and we start to get now Hamilton's coming into play here, my favorite musical. All right, because there's actually a good discussion of that where Hamilton is arguing with a farmer about how crazy it is that an island that's all the way across the sea can control the price of tea. All right, there's going to be a lot of Hamilton in here. You're going to have to deal with it. All right, and then finally we get the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson. The ideas, however, are very Lockean. They're right out of John Locke. All right. All right. Then we get John Adams and James Otis that are going to argue that Americans are being deprived of the rights of British citizens. They have to convince everybody that there's a reason to fight for independence. All right, Adams is going to defend John Hancock in a smuggling case. All right, English Bill of Rights are going to be cited. Listen, we have the same rights as British citizens. We're British citizens, therefore we should have the same rights. England is not giving us those rights, therefore we should be independent. All right. This is really important, guys. The Enlightenment, which we talked a little bit about, is really important in the idea that it taught Americans to question and to appeal to reason. All right, the idea that rights are natural to human beings, liberty, property are important, government's duties to protect those rights, and that's really key, guys. It's the government's duty to protect the rights of individual men. All right, and if they don't protect those rights, then those individual men have the right to band together and form a new government. All right, that is really the core of the American Revolution. Salutary neglect had allowed Americans to develop self-government. They had taxed themselves. They had controlled royal governors. All right, and just like we talked about, if you have a kid who's allowed to run wild by their parents, and then all of a sudden the parents are going to try to clamp down and impose all these rules on them, it's not going to work. All right, and that's really the core of what's going to cause the revolution. All right, lots of different people, guys. Just a quick rundown of some important people. James Otis, he's an early patriot. He was one of the few first to call for the Stamp Act Congress. All right, he fought for the writs of assistance, which we talked about. All right, all of these things. Patrick Henry is going to threaten George III. All right, very specifically with independence and the idea that we should fight for our liberty. All right, and later gives us the famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. Samuel Adams, we've talked about, organized the Sons of Liberty, organized the Communities of Correspondence. We have Benjamin Franklin, who originally was a diplomat to England and then to France, all right, and originally he wasn't all that keen on independence, all right, but he felt he was mistreated by the English, all right, that pushes him independence. Obviously, George Washington's an important guy. Declaration of Independence, we get written by Thomas Jefferson, one of many things the guy does. All right, Abigail Adams, all right, remember the ladies. All right, when John Adams is off fighting in the war and later on running the government, she runs her farm. Abigail Adams is sometimes called the first feminist in America. All right, she believed that women deserved the same rights as men and actually encouraged her husband to fight for that. Mercy Otis Warren is again a patriot. She's often considered the first historian of the Revolution. She wrote a lot about what was going on. All right, the Sons of Liberty we've talked a lot about. And we also had the Daughters of Liberty who participated in boycott. They produced homespun goods that people could buy instead of buying British goods. It wasn't just men. We talked about that. Women made cloth. Men joined the army. Both men and women supported boycotts. They worked to close courts to prevent land seizures. All right, if somebody couldn't pay their debts, they'd get their land taken away, right? It would be no different than foreclosing on a house today. All right, so they would work to close the courts to make sure that people couldn't actually have their land taken away. All right, women are going to join the army too. All right, they're going to be what are called camp followers. They're not going to fight, but they're there to cook, to clean, to nurse. All right, Molly Pitcher, who is considered with is a lot of pictures and ideas of her and stories about her. Really wasn't a person. All right, but the idea that there were women who actually took part in the revolution itself is an important concept. All right, women are going to run farms and businesses while the men are away, and slaves and free blacks are going to fight for the Continental Army. They're going to hope that freedom and that language of the revolution is going to actually lead to them getting their freedom as well. Obviously, we know that's not going to be the case. All right. We're going to have loyalist opposition, right? Not everybody is going to be all about independence. As a matter of fact, the vast majority of people are going to either not really care about independence or be against independence, all right? However, we're going to have assistance both from allies in Europe who were anti-British, as well as different colonies that are going to come together. All right, militias throughout the states are going to fight the British. All right, Washington keeps the army together. All right, Washington wasn't a great general in what we consider to be a great general today. He fought 9 major battles. He lost 6. All right, 3 and 6, not a real great number. All right, but he kept the country together. All right, the Dutch are going to provide gunpowder and loads to us. The French are going to offer their alliance after a great victory by the Americans at Saratoga. That's why Saratoga is such a key, because it allowed the French to think the Americans had a chance. All right, and the number one most important factor in the colonists winning, all right, was French aid. Loans, military aid, naval support. All right, Baron von Steuben and everybody's favorite fighting Frenchman, Marquis de Lafayette. And yes, for those of you that don't recognize it, that was another Hamilton reference. All right, second one. All right, we have these new ideas that are going to inspire new experiments and different forms of government. All right, we're going to have radical new ideas about politics, religion, and society. They're going to kind of be experimented on in America during this time period. All right, so we get all these ideas. We get John Locke, which we've talked about. We get Thomas Paine, which we've talked about. All right, a French philosopher named Montesquieu talks about the separation of powers, which is obviously going to factor its way into the American government. All right, John Winthrop, way back when, in his City Upon a Hill speech, emphasizes American exceptionalism. We've talked a lot about the fact that this idea of American exceptionalism is going to be the core of American culture all the way till today. A number of different groups, from the Pilgrims to the Catholics to the Quakers, are all going to come to America to pursue this idea of religious freedom, another radical idea. All right, and the Great Awakening is going to emphasize individual salvation. All right, the idea of an individual's right to choose their path to God. All right. And that again is going to be this idea of individual effort, individual freedom, individual rights. That plays into what our government's going to become as well. Remember that the colonists, we've talked a lot about this, have this idea that the Republican form of government based on the natural rights of people is the way to go. All right. And if we look at documents all the way back to the beginning of Englishmen arriving into the New World, all the way today, we can see that. All right. We can see it in the House of Burgesses, the Massachusetts Assembly. All right. The Constitution is based on this whole idea of popular sovereignty. We, the people. All right. The people control the government. All right, federalism, the idea that there's a blending of national governments and state governments. All right, and that's going to continue all the way till today again to be a very big controversy. All right, the idea of a two-house legislature, which is going to obviously be reflected in the Great Compromise, all right, which we'll talk about down the road here, is important. And the Seneca Falls Convention is actually going to use a lot of these ideas, and it's actually rewrite the Declaration to say all men and women are created equal. All right, we know it's going to take a long time before those ideals find their way into our government. All right, but the idea is there. All right. Now, we're going to start to see a push for abolition of slavery almost immediately after the war, and really even a little bit before the Revolutionary War. All right. Massachusetts is going to take the Declaration of Independence very seriously. It hears all men are created equal, and it believes it. It becomes the first state to abolish existing slavery. The rest of the North is going to follow suit. It's just going to take some time. Vermont's going to abolish slavery in 1777. Pennsylvania is going to pass a law in 1780 that says that any child born could not be a slave. All right, in other words, they're not going to free the slaves, but the children of slaves are therefore free, and therefore within a generation slavery will end. All right, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 is going to banish slavery anywhere in the Northwest. All right, we're going to talk about during the Constitution, it's written that the international slave trade could be abolished after 1808 and will be abolished by Thomas Jefferson. We get the Fugitive Slave Clause, however, that's in there, the Three-Fifths Compromise, which was obviously a really important compromise that we talked a lot about. All right, we get the development of the American Colonization Society in 1817, which wants to free the slaves, but again, to send them back to Africa. All right, led by future President Monroe. All right, which is why we get Liberia, Monrovia as the capital there. All right, Abigail Adams is going to fight for women. All right, so we're going to get this idea that political democracy should spread. All right, women are actually going to get the vote very early in New Jersey. All right, however, by 1807, they're going to lose that right again. All right, and Republican motherhood is going to be what women are going to be expected to do, and we'll talk about that later. Throughout all this, however, Native Americans are going to be consistently denied rights and are going to be consistently pushed farther and farther and farther west, which we'll obviously talk about a lot over the next 150 years in American history. All right. Women participated in the American Revolution. Remember, we talked about that, and therefore afterwards they're going to ask for expanded roles. All right. And this is where we get Republican motherhood, the idea that in order to have a good republic, you need an education. All right, so you need to educate, especially your sons, and that's the job of women. All right, women are going to argue that this doesn't mean that we should be second-class citizens. Again, Abigail Adams is going to be the first to really push this idea with her pamphlet or essay, Remember the Ladies. All right. It was interesting that there's a very significant paradigm shift here, a very significant shift in the way people think. Before the revolution, the general idea is that women were kind of be dangerous and had to be controlled. All right, but by 1800, and this is kind of part of the Second Great Awakening, men are started to be portrayed as people that had to be controlled. Women are pure, women are innocent, women are moral, and therefore it's their job to control the base instincts of us terrible men who can't really control our own morals. All right, so women are going to get more respect, all right, but it's still going to be the focus on them staying in the home, all right? Really, we're only going to see two major professions. We're going to get the Lowell Mill girls, all right, which are going to be the first group to really work outside the home, excuse me, and teachers, all right? But the Second Great Awakening is going to get them into reform movements, which over time is going to lead to them being involved in politics. All right. The American Revolution is going to be a beacon for the rest of the world. The French Revolution is heavily inspired by the American Revolution. Both Lafayette, who fought on the side of the Americans in the Revolution, is going to go back and push to have France freed as well. All right, there's going to be significant slave rebellions, and Haiti being the big one. All right, which was inspired by both the American and the French revolutions. All right, and there's going to be widespread independence movements in Latin America, which are going to use the language of the Declaration of Independence. All right, so the American Revolution is a source of inspiration for a number of oppressed groups throughout the world. All right, now, how are we going to form this government? How are we going to form a government that protects individual liberties and limits power? All right, remember, they just fought a war to get away from a king. They don't want to get involved with another one. All right, so many state constitutions are going to put the power in the hands of a legislative body, and that legislative body is going to be elected. All right, but for the most part, we're going to have pretty significant restrictions on who can vote in those elections. All right, Pennsylvania was the most radical. All right, they created a one-house legislature, no executive branch, and this is the key, no property requirement to vote at all. Males could only vote. Let's not go crazy. We're not going to allow women to vote yet. All right, but all males could vote, and that was really, really radical at the time. South Carolina, on the other hand, I know this is going to be a surprise to many, was the most conservative. All right, they restricted the right to vote or even to run to office for only its wealthiest, most powerful citizens. All right, most state constitutions somewhere in the middle. All right, somewhere in the middle. So we get the creation of the Articles of Confederation. We've talked about the fact the Articles of Confederation is insanely weak, all right, and it's going to be a miserable failure, all right. It does manage to do some good things, but for the most part, it's going to be a failure, all right. No executive branch, no judicial branch. All states get one vote in the Congress. It has two major weaknesses. You need a unanimous vote to change any rules. Guys, you can't get a unanimous vote to do anything. We couldn't get a unanimous vote on Monday to cancel class for the rest of the week. There'd be one person who'd be like, no, I need to learn, and you know who you are. All right, and two, there's no power to tax, so the federal government can't make any money. All right, Shays Rebellion, all right, remember, is going to be this rebellion that the federal government can't do anything about. All right, it doesn't have a standing army. It doesn't have the money to raise an army. All right, so the Shays Rebellion has to be put down by state militias, and it shows everybody that the federal government's just way too weak. All right, that's what's going to create the Constitutional Convention. All right, we're going to get a couple really important compromises. The Great Compromise, which is the Virginia plan, and the New Jersey plan. The Big State, Small State plan, which is going to give us two houses, one which is decided by representation, and the other one that's decided by all states being equal. All right, we're going to get three branches. We're going to get separation of powers, checks and balances. Make sure you know what all that stuff means, because that's a big deal. All right. And we get this national government idea. The national government shares powers with the states, all right? But the national government is supreme, and that is a constant debate and a constant controversy. And we've talked a lot about that with the loose interpretation of the Constitution, the strict interpretation of the Constitution, the elastic clause versus the 10th Amendment, all right, and all the controversy that's going to cause over time. All right, slavery is going to be a significant problem. We're going to get the Three-Fifths Compromise, all right, which is going to give the South a substantial advantage in the Electoral College in the House, all right, which is going to lead to the South controlling the early government, and especially Virginia, all right. International slave trade can't be touched until 1808, so you got 20 years of the international slave trade before the government's allowed to do anything about that. And we get the Fugitive Slave Clause put into place, all right? And that's going to be a constant problem. Slaves that escape to the north are supposed to be sent back to the south. That law is going to get stricter and stricter and stricter and stricter over time. All right. After the Constitution is written, there's this idea of, is it going to be ratified? All right, you have the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. All right, the Federalists are better organized, they're better prepared, they have a better name, okay? They have something they're in favor of. The Anti-Federalists just sound like they're just anti. All right, the Federalists are also going to control many newspapers. We're going to get the Federalist Papers, guys. We did read a couple of those, written by mainly Hamilton and Madison, which are good defenses of the Constitution. Remember, anti-federalists are worried about tyranny. They're worried about the federal government being too strong. They're worried about another monarchy. All right, but the key is the promise of Bill of Rights, the idea that if we include these rights in the Constitution, in the amendments to the Constitution, done, that will stop tyranny. All right, so that's going to be the key to the ratification of the Constitution. Rhode Island is the last person or last country, struggling here, last state to ratify the Constitution, and really they were looking at being the odd man out. They were looking at being treated like a foreign country. All right, so they finally do ratify the Constitution, but it's actually really late. Washington's actually already been elected and is in office before Rhode Island officially ratifies the Constitution. All right, we are going to get important presidents during this time period. They're going to do some significant stuff. We get Washington. He's going to create the cabinet. Could sing a little bit of that too from Hamilton, but I'll pass because we get Jefferson as the Secretary of State, Hamilton as the Secretary of Treasury, and then we get Knox as the Secretary of War. All right, creates the Army. He's the one that gets this 2-term limit into play. The idea that he steps down, he gives up power that was huge after 2 terms. That's going to set the precedent for other presidents doing the same thing all the way until the 1900s. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt doesn't step down after 2 terms, and then finally we get a constitutional amendment now that says that you have to step down. All right, he establishes neutrality as our foreign policy. Stay out of European problems. That is really the key to Washington's foreign policy, as well as Washington's farewell address. We get the federal court systems established. All right, we assume a national and state debts. We assume national taxes. We create the Bank of the United States. That's all Hamilton. All right, right, guys? Again, I could probably sing Cabinet Battle Number 1 here and talk about Hamilton's arguments and Jefferson's arguments, but I'll spare you guys. All right, we get the site of the national capital, which is on the Potomac, all right, which is, again, the dinner table compromise. All right, another great song in Hamilton about that. And again, the farewell address. Adams, we get the XYZ affair, which is going to lead to an undeclared war with France. And finally, the first peace treaty that's signed by the new U.S. government. All right, we get the decision to hand over power very peacefully to Jefferson, who is the opposite political party. That's going to be really important, the idea that we could peacefully transfer party between 2 groups that dislike each other and have very, very separate beliefs. All right, and the appointment of John Marshall, maybe the most important thing Adams did, appointing Marshall to create a strong Supreme Court, which is going to be a federalist court, which is going to constantly rule in favor of the federal government and the increasing of the power of the federal government. All right. We're going to get significant political leaders. Hamilton is going to be one, even though he's never president. Obviously, we're going to get this debate between the strict and the loose construction of the Constitution. All right? Strict interpretation of the Constitution. If it's not written there, you can't do it as a federal government. 10th Amendment says that anything that's not written in the Constitution is reserved for the state, so the federal government can't do it. Loose interpretation says that there's the elastic clause, which says that the federal government can do anything that's necessary and proper for the function of a government. All right, those two are going to butt heads numerous times all the way till today. All right, Hamilton's going to have this idea of a strong federal government and a strong presidency and a manufacturing nation like Great Britain, whereas Jefferson wants a weak national government, strong state governments, and an agrarian nation. Hamilton and Adams are pro-British. Jefferson and Madison are going to be pro-French. All right, Adams is going to win the presidency. Jefferson's going to be his vice president in 1796. That's going to cause problems, which is going to lead to a change in the way that we elect the vice president. All right. Adams and the Federalists are going to do some very shameful things. We talked about the Alien and Sedition Acts, all right, which are going to allow the deportation of foreigners, getting rid of Jeffersonians, not allowing new people into the country to become citizens until they're here a long time, to stop them from voting for Jeffersonians, and the Sedition Act, which basically says that if you talk badly about the president or Congress, you can go to jail. Obviously, a direct violation of the First Amendment, even though the Supreme Court said it wasn't, but that's because it was a Federalist Supreme Court, all right. Jefferson wins. To his credit, those are very quickly overturned, and Jefferson has a much freer, more open administration, I guess. We know that throughout this time we're going to start to the build of the rift between the South and the North. North wants to be a manufacturing state. The South wants to remain agricultural. The North really doesn't need slavery as far as economically. The South, especially after the invention of the cotton gin, does. All right. Then we get some culture. We get American culture going. As we all know, this is my favorite. Art, literature, and architecture, 3 things that I know very, very, very little about. But here's a few little tidbits for us that we can use to write maybe in an essay, as some specific historical evidence. At least we'll recognize if it shows up as a stimulus-based multiple choice question. Monticello in DC are Roman-style architecture, all right, which is going to become part of the American culture. Again, guys, we all know this is not my strength. Last thing we're going to talk about, key concept 3.3, we're going to get migration throughout North America, all right, and conflict between peoples and native groups. All right, so native groups are going to reject claims that they should give up more and more and more of their land. We're going to drive, the American people are going to drive the Native Americans into smaller and smaller areas. All right, over and over again, that's going to happen. We're going to get Native Americans who are going to try to band together. There are going to have some limited success. Little Turtle, very famously in the Western Confederacy, is going to actually defeat 2 American armies. However, sooner or later, they're going to get defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, and that they will lose land. All right. The British had been arming Native Americans. Jay's Treaty gets them to stop. All right, most Americans just wanted the Native Americans gone or dead. All right, the most liberal idea is that they should assimilate and become like us. All right, like the colonists. That's the most liberal idea. Very, very few people out there that were arguing that they should just be left alone. All right. We're also going to get conflict between states. We're going to get speculation, people buying up tracts of land, people just moving out and sitting in that land. So you might have somebody that officially bought the land, but you got other people who are living in the land who actually controls it. All right. Pennsylvania, New York, and Connecticut are going to fight over land claims out west. We're going to get Shays Rebellion and Whiskey Rebellion, which are frontier rebellions defying political controls back east. All right. There's some idea that the West and the Southwest would join the Spanish because they really needed the Mississippi River, which the Spanish controlled. So we got conflict between the Native Americans and the colonists. We got conflict among colonists within individual states. All right. And over time, we're going to get some land ordinances to try to settle those. All right. The Ordinance of 1784 sets up how we become a state. We've talked a lot about that, getting the amount of population, writing a constitution, electing assembly, applying for statehood. All right. The Land Ordinance of 1775 is going to set up a grid system and is going to set up a portion of land sales to finance public schools. It's also going to ban slavery in the Old Northwest, all right, and it's going to give the West opportunities to come into the states, to become states and not be worried that they're going to be eternal colonies, which was the thought at the time, all right. E is the last one we're going to talk about. The Spanish are still out there, right? Even after the war, we're going to get Father Junipero Serra, who again is going to set up to build missions in California. We have the encomienda system of forced labor. All right, they're trying to secure land, especially California, against American claims. All right, by the 19th century, Mexico had freed Native Americans. They had been granted ranches. Native Americans had intermarried with a lot of the Mexicans. All right, and this is all an attempt to try to keep the Americans from what they think is their destiny, which we'll obviously talk a lot about in period 4, the idea of manifest destiny, the idea that they had to move west. All right, a lot of information, guys. Good idea to just listen, kind of review your notes as you go through, look at the questions, look at the summaries, look at your EQs on your Cornell notes, all right, and start to get ready for that final. We got a couple weeks here. Good luck and good night.